Walk into Chartres Cathedral on a quiet Tuesday morning in October when the tour groups haven't arrived yet and the early light is coming in low through the south transept windows, and something happens to your sense of scale that you don't quite expect. The columns are wrong. Not architecturally wrong. Wrong for you. They are too wide at the base, too far apart, proportioned in a way that makes your body feel like it has wandered into a space that was designed with a different body in mind. Most visitors chalk this up to the grandeur of medieval ambition. Architects reaching beyond their means. Stonemasons trying to intimidate the faithful. But a small group of researchers, working in France and England and Germany for the last several decades, have been asking a different question. What if the proportions aren't a mistake? What if they were built exactly to spec? The official story of cathedral construction goes something like this. Sometime around the 10th and 11th centuries, European towns began competing to build the largest, most elaborate stone churches the continent had ever seen. Peasants hauled stone. Priests drew up plans. Generations of craftsmen passed the work down like a long, slow family business. The great Gothic cathedrals of France and England took anywhere from 80 to 200 years to complete. Notre Dame de Paris, begun around 1163, wasn't finished until roughly 1345. Cologne Cathedral, started in 1248, was still being built in the 19th century. The official timeline is so long, so spread across so many lifetimes, that nobody has to explain any single generation's contribution in great detail. The scope of the project absorbs all the uncomfortable questions about labor and scale. But some of those questions are worth asking out loud. A structural engineer named David Macaulay spent years studying medieval construction methods in preparation for his architectural breakdowns of Gothic cathedral design, and one of the things that struck him most was the consistency of the lifting apparatus evidence. Cranes used in cathedral construction were enormous, not crane-like in the way we think of it. The great wheel cranes recovered from cathedral sites, documented in illustrations from the period and in occasional surviving examples, were built on a scale that assumes the men operating them were considerably larger than modern labourers. The treadmill wheels at sites like Salisbury and Canterbury had interior diameters of up to 14 feet. A modern man standing inside one of these wheels barely reaches the top with his arms extended. The physics of the wheel only work if the operator's stride covers a specific arc. The wheels were sized for a stride that was roughly 30% longer than the average modern stride. This is the kind of detail that gets glossed over in most architectural histories. The stones themselves are the other problem. Not the small decorative stones, the capital stones, the carved friezes, the foundation stones, the massive load-bearing blocks set into the deepest layers of the great cathedral floors, the ones that were placed before any scaffolding existed and that were never designed to be moved again. At Chartres, foundation stones in the nave measure between 12 and 18 feet in length and weigh upward of 40 tons. At Durham Cathedral in northern England, the primary foundation courses include individual blocks that the engineering firm commissioned to assess structural stability in 1988, estimated at 60 tons or more. A geological surveyor named Peter Harrington, who worked on that Durham assessment, wrote in his unpublished notes, later shared with a historian named John Michel, that the placement of those stones was something he found genuinely difficult to account for with any known medieval lifting technology. The blocks weren't just heavy. They were set with a precision that left tolerances of less than half an inch between courses, half an inch across 60 tons of stone. Harrington was not a fringe figure. He was a fellow of the Geological Society of London. The tool marks are where things get stranger still. In the late 1970s, a French archaeologist named Jean-Pierre Adam published an analysis of tool marks found on dressed stone at several major Romanesque and early Gothic sites in the Loire Valley. Adam had spent years studying Roman construction techniques and had developed a method for extracting information about tool size and the physical force behind each stroke from the marks left in limestone and sandstone. What he found at the Romanesque sites, the ones predating the Gothic period, was a consistent pattern of tool application that implied a striking force and a grip width substantially beyond what a standard adult male hand would produce. The chisel mark suggested grips of 9 to 11 inches across the palm. the average adult MA. La Palme today is about 3.5 inches wide. Adam published his findings in a monograph on Romanesque stone technology that was widely read in French academic circles. The conclusions about grip width appeared in a footnote, not in the body of the text, in a footnote. That is how most of this evidence travels, through footnotes, through unpublished assessments, through the kind of professional observations that researchers make to each other in hallways after conferences and almost never commit to print. The doorways of the earliest cathedrals are worth a separate examination. At the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, the Porta de las Platerías, one of the oldest surviving Romanesque doorways in Iberia, has a threshold opening of approximately 12 feet in height and 8 feet in width. These are not unusual dimensions for a cathedral door in the functional sense. You want processions to pass through, you want ceremonial space, you want the entrance to feel monumental. But the proportional relationship between the door opening and the architectural frame around it is specific. The relieving arch above the threshold, the decorative columns flanking the entrance, the carved capitals at the tops of those columns, all of these elements are scaled to the door opening itself. An architectural historian named Otto von Simpson, writing about the proportional systems of Romanesque architecture in his 1956 study of Gothic cathedral geometry, noted that the human figure implied by the proportions of the earliest Romanesque doorways was significantly taller than the figure implied by later Gothic work. Von Simpson attributed this to a shift in aesthetic priorities. He was probably right about the shift. He may not have been right about the cause. The scaffolding evidence is harder to wave away. Scaffold holes, the rectangular cavities punched into cathedral walls to hold the horizontal timbers of working platforms, survive at dozens of sites across France and Spain. These holes are not random. They are spaced at intervals that correspond to the working height of the men on the platform, the distance between a man's feet and the level at which he could comfortably hold a tool against the wall. A structural archaeologist named Norbert Nussbaum spent a significant portion of his career measuring scaffold hole spacing at major French Gothic sites and published his findings in a 1994 study of medieval construction technology. The average scaffold hole spacing at sites predating 1100 CE was between 9 and 10 feet. The average at sites built after 1200 CE was between 6 and 7 feet. The shift is consistent and tracks almost exactly with the transition from Romanesque to Gothic construction. 9 to 10 feet between scaffold courses implies a working reach of somewhere between 8 and 9 feet from the floor of the platform. For a man to work comfortably at that height without a stool or secondary platform, he needs to be somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall. Most people who encounter this data for the first time assume there's a simple explanation involving ladders or stools on the scaffold platforms. There isn't. The whole point of scaffold spacing is to eliminate the need for stools. You set the platform at working height so your masons can apply force directly, without leverage being compromised by a secondary surface. Stonemasons working on ladders cannot apply the kind of consistent, controlled force that produces the tolerance levels found in pre-Gothic stonework. This is not a fringe position in construction engineering. It is a basic principle of how masonry work is done. The scaffold spacing at the early Romanesque sites is sized for a body that is not a modern body. The records that accompanied the construction of these buildings are fragmentary, deliberately so in some cases and simply lost in others, but they are not entirely absent. In the monastic archives of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, which is generally credited as the origin point of the Gothic style in France, there are inventory documents from the Abbacy of Suger, who oversaw the reconstruction of the choir between 1140 and 1144. Suger's own account of the rebuilding, the Liber de Rebus in Administratione Sua Gestis, describes the labour force in terms that translators have consistently rendered as simply workmen or craftsmen, without much attention to the Latin that Suger actually used. A classicist named Francis Guise, working in the 1980s on a broader study of medieval labour, noted in passing that some of Suger's references to his primary stone handlers used terminology that in other contexts carried connotations of exceptional physical scale. This is not a claim that Suger was describing giants. It is an observation that the terminology was not entirely neutral. that the words chosen were not the standard vocabulary for ordinary workmen. This kind of linguistic residue shows up in other places. In the administrative records of Winchester Cathedral, maintenance documents from the 13th and 14th centuries describe repair work on earlier Norman sections of the building in terms that repeatedly distinguish between the original construction and the newer work in ways that go beyond style. The phrase used by one 14th century clerk, rendered in the original Latin as built by those of the former age, is notable partly because the Norman construction it refers to was only about 200 years old at the time, not ancient, 2 centuries back. And yet the clerk felt the need to describe those builders as a category distinct from his contemporary workforce. The distinction mattered enough to him that he wrote it down twice in the same document. The height of the Norman piers at Winchester is about 25 feet. Most discussion of giant builders in the context of cathedral construction gets immediately routed into mythology and dismissed. The dismissal is understandable if you approach it from the standard framework, but the actual physical evidence, the tool marks and the scaffold spacing and the foundation stone placements and the doorway proportions doesn't come from mythology. It comes from structural analysis conducted by mainstream archaeologists and engineers who had no particular investment in the answer their data produced. What they found accumulated in the footnotes and the annexes and the unpublished assessments because the central claims of those studies were about something else. Nobody set out to find evidence of giant builders. The evidence appeared in the margins of research conducted for entirely different purposes. That is actually the most compelling thing about it. Confirmation bias runs the other direction here. If a researcher is trying to prove that medieval peasants built these cathedrals with hand tools and rope, finding scaffold spacing that implies 8-foot workers is an inconvenience, not a discovery. You explain it away and move on. The fact that researchers like Nussbaum and Adam and Harrington noted what they found at all, even in footnotes and marginal comments, suggests that the data was genuinely difficult to account for within the standard framework. You only mention things that you can't make disappear. The skeletal record is more complicated to interpret, but it points in the same direction. Across northern Europe, burial sites associated with pre-Christian and early Christian periods have produced skeletal remains of unusual size with enough frequency that the pattern is documented in physical anthropology literature, even when it is not prominently discussed. A physical anthropologist named Marion Henneberg, working on a compilation of European skeletal databases in the 1990s, identified a statistically significant cluster of remains in the archaeological record of northern France, the Rhineland, and the British Isles that fell into a height range of between 7 and 8.5 feet and dated broadly to the period between 500 BCE and 1200 CE. Henneberg's primary study was about something else, population health trends, but the anomalous height cluster was real enough that she included it in the appendices as a data point requiring further investigation. Most of the remains in this cluster were associated with high-status burials, not common graves. They were buried with tools and with architectural implements. Some of them were buried inside the foundations of churches. This is not common knowledge, and it was not widely reported at the time Henneberg published her work. But the pattern is there for anyone who goes looking for it in the primary literature. High-status, physically anomalous burials placed in association with early religious architecture at sites scattered across a region that corresponds almost exactly with the early spread of the Romanesque building tradition. The people who designed and built the first cathedrals were placed inside them when they died. And the people who were placed inside them were not standard-sized people. The geometry of the buildings themselves encodes this in a way that nobody ever quite intended as a code, but that functions like one anyway. Gothic and Romanesque cathedral proportions are based on systems. The specific systems varied by region and period, but they were all derived from a common root, a proportional framework that traced back to the same source documents, the same pattern books that circulated through the monastic networks of Western Europe from roughly the 9th century onward. These pattern books, the ones that survived in partial form in places like the sketchbook of Villard de Honnecourt, a 13th century master builder whose notebook is one of the most studied documents in architectural history, established proportional relationships between structural elements by reference to the human figure. not an idealized human figure in the abstract. A specific human figure. Villard's figures are tall by modern standards. Not fantastically tall, but consistently tall. His drawn figures, when you scale them against the doorways and column heights he specifies elsewhere in the same notebook, imply a baseline human height of somewhere between 6.5 and 7 feet, as the design module for the buildings he was documenting. Villard was not documenting imaginary buildings. He was documenting buildings that existed. There is a version of this story that ends with certainty, with a clean conclusion about who built the cathedrals, and what exactly they looked like, and where they came from, and where they went. That version doesn't exist yet. What exists is a set of data points distributed across several different disciplines: structural engineering and physical anthropology, and architectural history and classical philology, that are individually explicable and collectively very difficult to dismiss. The scaffold holes are sized for a different body. The tool marks came from a different hand. The foundation stones were placed with a precision that the documented technology of the period cannot fully account for. And the remains buried in the foundations of the earliest stone churches are, in a meaningful cluster, much larger than the remains of the people who came after them to maintain and worship in, and eventually modify those same buildings. The stones were not trying to tell you anything. But, if you measure them carefully enough, they tell you anyway. The last pre-Gothic Romanesque cathedrals in France were completed in the early 12th century. By 1150, the Gothic style had begun to replace them almost everywhere. The change happened fast, architecturally speaking, and it brought with it that shift in scaffold spacing Nussbaum documented, the drop from 9-foot intervals to 6-foot intervals, the shift toward proportions that worked for a body closer to the body of a modern person. The buildings that came after are magnificent, but they are not quite the same kind of magnificent as the ones that came before. Something changed between the first stone churches and the great Gothic cathedrals, something that shows up in the physical evidence of how the buildings were made, rather than in what they looked like from the outside. The hands that cue, the first stones were not the same hands that cut the last ones. The measurements make that much plain.